Howdy! This lecture is taken from the reading Frontier Crossings, Cultural Dissonance, Intercultural Learning, and the Multicultural Personality, written in 2003 by Michael Allen, and it appears in the Journal of Research in International Education. This lecture is for the course INST 222, Foundations of Education in a Multicultural Society. So we'll do our best to highlight these important terms that appear in the article. You can find these terms on the lecture note outline for this reading. So let's begin with the big idea. This article examines the process of intercultural learning in an international school, particularly the role played by peer group interaction. It identifies the affective as well as cognitive processes involved and highlights the importance of cultural dissonance in a model of intercultural learning that shows how multiculturalism can be achieved, but also how the intermediate outcomes, which are not always the correct outcomes, of such processes as ethnocentrism, adaptation, and assimilation often can result. Now, if you take a look at the image on your right, we see in the center of that image uh, the term cultural dissonance. Now, cultural dissonance is this kind of uncomfortable state of discord or disharmony that one can feel when you are entered into a new cultural environment or a new arrangement of other people in society that is different from what you're used to. Now, the author Michael Allen is advocating that we can use this uncomfortable state to work through the process of intercultural learning. And if we do it the right way, it will lead one to better understand multiculturalism and arrive at a better multicultural personality, right? So that's what happens on the upside, right? Hence the arrow is pointing upwards. However, if we enter into a cultural arrangement and it makes us feel somewhat uncomfortable and we don't go through the process correctly, it can lead to some damaging outcomes such as ethnocentrism, adaptation, and assimilation. So we're going to talk about these ideas in this article. Let's move on. So let me share this quote with you by Aristotle. It is the mark of an educated mind to be able to entertain a thought without accepting it. Very simple words, but one of the bigger ideas that come out of this quote is the idea that we often need to be confronted with ideas that don't necessarily resonate or agree with our own ways of thinking, but that we will spend the time just entertaining the ideas, the cultures, the proclivities of others. And at the end of the day, we don't have to accept the way that other people carry out their lives or their culture, but we do need to, out of a place of just mere respect, spend some time entertaining their way of encountering the world. And that is the true mark of an educated mind, when you don't accept your ways as the only way or the correct way, but that you recognize others have a culture that they validate just as much as you have a culture that you validate as well. Let's move on. So we will find in our life that when we come into these opportunities of other cultures, right, that we will feel a sense of uneasiness, a sense of discomfort, a sense of disharmony. We will become disoriented, almost bewildered and perplexed. Why do they behave that way? Why are those people, that cultural group, thinking in that way? But our author is suggesting that we don't need to run away from situations or cultures that we find a bit disarming, but that we need to work through the process because this is a part of intercultural learning. So let's begin with the beginning of the article. And in the introduction, the article suggests that internationalism is a duty of genuine education. So the point there is that one cannot just simply go through school and get a degree in teaching or sociology or engineering and not have an opportunity to study these ideas of internationalism. And if you shortchange yourself and not have these kinds of experiences, then you truly are not getting a genuine education. The author goes on to share with us some definitions on what it means to be a multicultural person or to have a multicultural personality. And he begins with Hoops in 1979, who says that the state in which one has mastered the knowledge and developed the skills necessary to feel comfortable and communicate effectively with people of any culture encountered and in any situation involving a group of diverse cultural backgrounds. That's when you know that you are a multicultural person. And Hoops goes on to say that the multicultural person is one who has learned how to learn culture. So we have to, if we're going to be a genuine student of knowledge and learning, that we have to get involved in this process of learning about other cultures. It's part of the responsibility to being a genuinely educated person. The author goes on to share with us some ideas by Adler. And Adler talks about the development of the person when one gets involved in internationalism or intercultural learning. And Adler says that throughout the transitional experience, the individual is presented with differences in complexity. When differences cannot be ignored, they become distorted. This distortion gives rise to emotions that each person must come to understand experientially. In so doing, learning, self-awareness, and personal growth take place. So Adler is proposing that a part of our own personal development means coming into contact with these disorienting kinds of experiences, that we have to experience these opportunities experientially. That means you can't read about it, you can't talk about it, you can't watch videos, but you have to go through the process, right? And that these distortions will give rise to emotions that you gotta work through and come through some kind of new self-awareness on your own. The author, Allen, goes on to tell us some of the objectives of this kind of intercultural learning and multiculturalism. So what's the point? Why would one get involved in intercultural learning, taking courses, or trying to understand multiculturalism? And Allen says that doing so, putting ourselves in these kinds of situations or learning this new information, helps our interaction skills. We just learn how to get along with people who are different from ourselves. It also supports our own personal growth. Allen goes on to say that intercultural learning frees individuals of ethnocentrism. And ethnocentrism is this belief that your culture is the only way and the right way. And it gives one the capacity to step into and imaginatively participate in the other's worldview. Now that's really powerful, that once you start to really become a student of intercultural learning, you learn to have more empathy and you want to avail yourself of those opportunities to step into the shoes of another. Our author tells us that cultural dissonance can get in the way of intercultural learning and multiculturalism. Now, it can be a positive thing and it can support us and propel us to become a person with a multicultural personality, but sometimes cultural dissonance can cause harm. So it can go one way or the other. And when it goes the other, it can cause ethnocentrism, it can cause adaptation, where you just develop some coping strategies to just sort of deal with other people, or assimilation, where you learn how to take on the culture of the dominant culture and abandon your own culture. So we need to be very vigilant about cultural dissonance, because it can be a positive towards our own intercultural learning, or it can get in the way and cause ethnocentrism, adaptation, or assimilation. So the author does something really nice for us. He doesn't just talk about these issues, but he provides a nice case study for us to look at these issues. And so what he did, he performed a study, a case study, at an international secondary school in the Netherlands. And there were 171 participants. These were students aged 11 to 18. So the students were asked to write stories and narratives of pupils starting at their school from an emic, i.e. insider perspective. So these students just had to free write. They were asked to just talk about their experiences, either firsthand or secondhand, or what they knew of what it was like sort of starting at this school. And so in our reading, you'll see several figures, and figures 1 through 3 give us some biographical data, pretty much some demographics on who the students were at this school. And so what turned out from all this data that was collected, the students' writings, that this information was gathered, and in order to make sense out of all this written data from the students, the author arranged it by coding the information, then separating it into major themes, and then he analyzed all of the student writing. And so once all of that student writing was sort of analyzed, the author determined that there were 7 major categories. And these categories, from the students' own words, from those 171 participants, were ranked in what he calls domains. So take a look at figure 4 in your reading. And so what you should understand is that the author doesn't focus on all 7 domains in the reading, but the author just focuses on that first domain, peer group interaction, how the students, those 171 students, how they felt about interacting with their peers, right? What it was like starting school and those social situations. And so that's what you'll hear in the remainder of the article. The focus on that one domain, peer group interaction. And if you take a look at table 1, you'll see that that domain is broken up with more specifics. So at your leisure, please take a look at table 1. So the author proposes that by comparing phenomena in that same domain, that one domain, talking about peer groups, we can see the workings of the process involved in the formation of cultural attitudes and identity in the setting of an international school. The essence of the interpretive stance is the temporal cycle working backward from the present to help the construction of a defined, refined, and corrected and coherent past. The relationship between the phenomena and the narratives and their implications in the process of intercultural learning are complex and derive etic, i.e. outsider generalizations in this respect, and cannot be fully understood without reference to cross-cultural psychology and other acculturation studies. So sounds very complicated, but what the author is proposing is that by paying attention to the students' own words, their narrative, you get an idea of how to start to interpret what's going on in terms of the students' ideas about their identities and all of that. And the author proposes that it becomes more complex because the students were asked to write from an emic or insider point of view, and he's offering some kind of analysis from an etic or outsider point of view. And he's telling us that he has to go to the literature from psychology and acculturation studies to help him make sense out of the students' own words. Let's move on. Before he tells us a little bit about what the students are thinking and sort of the bigger ideas from their words, he goes into a conversation about culture in the third part of the reading. And he offers 2 formal definitions of culture, and he cites Breslin and tells us that culture is these reoccurring patterns of behavior. He then goes on to cite Minora and tells us that cultural meaning systems are implanted in society's everyday ways of doing things. And he shares 2 metaphors to help us understand culture a bit better. And he talks about the iceberg metaphor and also onion. And the point by sharing this literature is for us to see that both of these ideas from these scholars share the common idea that there are some superficial traits about culture that are obvious and very overt, but there are these hidden traits about culture that we need to be aware of. So if you take a look at the image of the iceberg concept of culture on the right, we get a sense of what uh, Alan is trying to share. So there are things about our culture that are above the waterline. So pay attention to the waterline. And so these are the obvious bits of culture that we can put our finger on, and we can point to. They're tangible, they're real, and they're superficial. Things like fine arts, literature, drama, cooking. But what's really interesting about this iceberg is that even though we can see a part of the iceberg above the waterline, there's a huge part of the iceberg below the waterline. And those are those hidden traits of culture in societies, right? So your ideas about courtship or conception of justice or rules about decency or conversational patterns or facial expressions. So the author is trying to get us to see and understand that all these rules and ideas about culture are out of our sight line. They're primarily out of our awareness. So, but we should be clear that there are these tangible things above the waterline when it comes to culture that we can see, feel, taste, and touch. But there are these ideas about culture below the waterline that are invisible to us, but nonetheless they are there, and they are very important to how people think about who they are, and how people sort of operate within their group and define culture for themselves. And he goes on to tell us, Alan, our author of this reading, that culture operates on a continuum, right? That it runs from the invisible to the visible or overt. So if you take a look at the figure 6 on your right, we see that on the far left of the figure, we have these unconscious bits of culture, like our habits and ways of doing things and our perception of time and perception of decency. These are the unconscious bits of culture. But as you move further along and we move to the far right of figure 6, we see that those tangible bits of culture, things like rules and laws, are expressed along this continuum. The author tells us that there are subtle differences between cultures. So the laws and rules, let's say, of Asian Americans are different from the laws and rules and the spoken and the unspoken of white Americans. And we need to be cognizant of that fact. He goes on to tell us that culture is very dynamic and evolving. It's not static. It doesn't stay still. It's very much like a phenomenon, and that it changes, and it's a process. It's evolving, and it is dynamic. Alan tells us that all of us have cultural values. Doesn't matter what cultural group you come from, and we see our cultures as the norm, and we see every other culture as different, and that we are right and that their cultures are wrong. The author tells us that cultural identity is important for every cultural group. So it's so important that we recognize that not only do others have a culture, but our cultural groups also have a culture. And that he points to the example of migrant students, in that this is a classic example of migrant students coming into a situation and immediately feeling or experiencing that sense of cultural dissonance or that state of discord. The author shares that culture refers to widely shared ideals, values, formation, and use of categories, assumptions about life, and goal-directed activities that become consciously or subconsciously accepted as right and correct by people who identify themselves as members of a society. The author, in part 4 of the reading, tells us that cultural dissonance is an uncomfortable sense of discord, disharmony, confusion, or conflict experienced by people. And he tells us that cultural dissonance can result from encountering a new culture. Just think about the experiences you've had, maybe going to a new school or going to a new country. And these differences can be very overt features of the culture, like going to another country and realizing that the language is different and feeling sort of out of sorts. Or these differences can be very subtle. They can be these nonverbal cues or codes that you aren't quite sort of clear about, but you realize something is off and it makes you feel uncomfortable. And the author goes on to define culture shock, which is a state of stress and anxiety that results from the disturbing impression we get and the loss of equilibrium we feel when we lose our familiar signs and symbols of social intercourse and when we encounter environmental differences in an alien culture. So we see that in cultural dissonance, having that sense of disequilibrium is not necessarily a bad thing, but culture shock is when we get that kind of anxiety that results from that disturbing impression. Now, when we go through a culture shock, the effects can be amusing, and you end up telling, stories, for example, of when you went to Paris and couldn't speak the language. Or culture shock can cause trauma. People just can't figure out their way of settling in to a new culture. And those of us who are professionals in certain settings or working with children, it's an issue that we may want to really play close attention to. Part 5 of our reading, we're introduced to one of those themes from the narratives of the students who participated in the case study that Alan talks about. So if you see, what you see here on the screen is an excerpt from a Filipino student, one of the 171 students that participated in this case study. So this is what the student had to say on one of his sort of experiences with a peer. He says, "What I don't want in this school is the Dutch," talking about the national department. "Starting from the beginning of the year, I felt uncomfortable, especially when going to the gym. When I go there and see Dutch students, I feel unwelcome, and I feel they don't care. There are also people from Dutch department who are so unpolite. They just bump you, and they just walk away and bump another person. They do it on purpose." So that is this Filipino student's perspective at this school in the Netherlands. And so we have to ask ourselves, what's going on there in this peer group interaction? And so the author says that it is perhaps the fact that this student has his own kind of classification system of what he thinks should be going on, and he may be looking at this incident from his own lens, his own perspective, and it may be giving him some misleading or confusing interpretations. As we move on to part 6 of the reading, we are introduced to another excerpt from another student of the 171 participants. This time it's a student of Dutch nationality. And this Dutch student says, "Me and my friends were playing American football. Then the Dutch kids came and took our ball and kicked me and my friends around and stole my ball and went away. The principal didn't do anything about it. He said, 'Well, don't play outside anymore.' The Dutch kids always push us around when we were waiting in front of the canteen. I hate these Dutch kids. They always push us when we go to gym and steal our things from our bags. They kick us, hit us. It sucks." Now, what I want you all to pay attention to is that the student quoted is of Dutch nationality. His first and home language is Dutch, and he has Dutch parents. And he's illustrating the desire to identify with the in-group, in this case the international students, and attribute negative characteristics to the out-group, which would be the Dutch students. So even though he is a Dutch kid, he's trying really hard to fit in with the international students, and he doesn't want to be affiliated with those Dutch kids. And so this is a form of assimilation where he wants to adopt the dominant culture, and he is almost abdicating his own culture. And so we need to look out for this. So even though we see this cultural dissonance going on, we see this Dutch kid who doesn't want to be a part of the other Dutch kids. He wants to abandon his own culture so that he could fit in a bit better. How distressing. Part 7 of our reading, we have the topic on cultural dissonance and intercultural learning. On the far right of your screen, we see an excerpt from a Brazilian student at this international school in the Netherlands. And the Brazilian student says, "People here are not like people in Brazil. I am used to be much more into a group, much more together. Here they don't really care if you are alone. If you want to have some friends, you have to go to them because they'll never come to you. Even at school, maybe Brazilian people are too close to each other, but even at school, people usually, they're close with the group from your own country. Not everyone, there are some nice people here, but anyway, I'm starting to like it here because even being difficult to make a friend, when you do it, it's a real friend." So the Brazilian student, if you can hear what he's saying from the author's perspective, he comes from a very collectivist culture, so he's not used to maybe the Brazilian students, the other Brazilian students not coming together, not, the like students seeking each other out. So he's a bit disappointed from that. And he describes the dissonance resulting from confrontation with an individualistic culture. The author tells us that the realization of cultural differences is the first step to intercultural learning, and that cognitive confrontation is the questioning of one's own values while at the same time giving reciprocal cognitive understanding of other cultures. So we need to do something that we don't see the students doing, and that is taking into consideration our own culture and then trying to sort of reconcile a new culture that we may be introduced to. Kids don't have that kind of wherewithal to go through that. But we need to bring that to their awareness so that they're able to grow, right? So that they're able to have a kind of personal development in terms of understanding their own culture while they're understanding other cultures, so that they won't be confronted with these acute bouts of homesickness. The author also introduces us to this idea of metacultural awareness, and it is the capability of considering culture as a distinct component of one's own culture. So in a metacultural awareness model, we are always understanding the fact that we are interpreting our experiences with other people from this idea that we have taken into consideration our own culture. Some of us operate and don't take into account the fact that we have a culture and that our own culture may be getting in the way of how we interpret what's going on with others. The author introduces us to this process of intercultural learning in part 8 of the reading, and he tells us that intercultural learning happens on a continuum, that we should move, if we do it correctly, and it's not an automatic process, from one stage to another, right? From awareness to understanding to acceptance and to appreciation. And if we can move through those steps, we can get to that place of being a kind of multiculturalist or having multicultural personality. But the author tells us that this kind of growth from awareness to appreciation is not automatic, and that there are sometimes these roadblocks. And so those arrows that are pointing to the right can be the roadblocks, and the roadblocks are ethnocentrism, adaptation, and assimilation. So multiculturalism ideally should be the goal, but these roadblocks sometimes can get in the way. The author tells us also, if you take a look at the screen on your right, that the intercultural learning process happens in 4 learning styles, and that we can cycle through these learning styles if we're paying attention, right? Through concrete experience all the way through active experimentation. And so if we take a look at figure 8 two big ideas should jump out at us. And again, the author is telling us that this movement from awareness to appreciation is not automatic, and that we bring with us to any cultural experience our own concrete experiences. And if we're paying attention, we'll reflect on it, we'll have abstract conceptualization that we'll start to understand the formation of concepts and generalizations, and then we are more inclined to move through active experimentation. So this should repeat itself over and over again. And if we are moving through this cycle in a very productive way, then we will cycle through to different levels of development. And if you pay attention, we see that the first level would be awareness, and the second level would be understanding, and we will continue, hopefully, if we are on a developmental path, through the last level of appreciation. So we're back to the image that started our lecture. So we understand, hopefully, that cultural dissonance is when we are confronted with new and strange cultural situations, and it gives us a sense of being disoriented or perplexed or unclear. But the author is saying, don't avoid these situations because they can be helpful. If we pay attention and if we go through the intercultural learning process, and if we really think about our own experiences, we're reflective, we're open to sort of entertaining these ideas, we can move further along the continuum and develop a multicultural personality. However, if we avoid and go into culture shock and retreat from these kinds of cultural experiences, then some damaging effects, some roadblocks, if you will, can emerge, such as ethnocentrism, this belief that your way, your culture is the best and most valuable and everyone else is wrong, or adaptation, where you develop coping mechanisms or strategies for dealing with people who are different just so that you don't have to interact with them in a positive way, or you can assimilate. And that can be dangerous for people who totally give in to a dominant culture and they abandon their own culture as well. Now, this article ended with some good news for the author because he was able to put together a list of suggestions for improving the peer relationships at this international school in the Netherlands. So figure 9 talks about some of the suggestions that were shared. For example, peer support for the students at the school, cultural affirmation, and also social activities where the students would get an opportunity to work together. I think that's great when we can go through a kind of research exercise, and then at the end of the exercise have a clear set of what can happen to support the school and the learners. So I hope you're asking, so what? What does this mean to me? I'm an Aggie. What does this mean for me and my own professional development? What we do know is that Aggies, like every human being on this planet, we tend to sort of retreat. We don't put ourselves in situations where we have cultural dissonance because a lot of us don't want to go through that, sense of being disoriented. We stick with people who think like us and who act like us and who live the way that we live. And the author tells us that's not a real genuine education when we don't put ourselves in these situations and have international or cultural experiences to help us grow. We should know that there are huge implications for having that kind of alone cultural experience, what Gillian Tett calls the silo effect. And when we operate with people who just think like us and look like us and act the way that we act, we're limiting our education, we're limiting who we are and what we can potentially be. Those limitations can carry on into our professions, whether we're going to be an engineer or we're going to be a sociologist, a psychologist, or an educator. We need to know that we need to interact with each other, put ourselves in those kinds of uncomfortable situations that stretch us, that help us to grow. And when we interact with people who are different from ourselves, we cannot help but to be elevated by them. The Texas A&M University is very interested in undergraduate students learning how to learn from others. And when you look at the experiences that we count as being high impact for undergraduate learners, you'll see one of those bullet points is diversity in global learning in courses or programs that examine difficult differences. So the goal of Texas A&M, like any four-year institution around our beautiful nation, is that our learners will have these kinds of experiences that help us to stretch and grow. And we don't do that when we stay in silos. Thank you for your time, and gig 'em.